Daniel stood alone in the lab long after everyone else had gone home. The building was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy. On the table in front of him was an experiment that had been repeated for more than 100 years. An experiment so simple that even students could understand it. A small machine sent tiny particles of light toward a metal plate with two thin openings. Behind the plate was a blank screen waiting to record the result. It should not have been mysterious. It should not have cared whether Daniel was tired, curious, or afraid. It was just equipment, metal and wires and light. And yet, every time he ran it, something felt wrong. He pressed the button. The particles fired one by one toward the two slits. On the screen behind them, a pattern slowly began to appear. Not two bright lines, as common sense would suggest, but many soft bands of light and shadow, spread out like ripples in water. The particles were behaving like waves, moving through both slits at the same time, interfering with themselves. Daniel leaned closer to the screen. "This makes no sense," he whispered, though he already knew the explanation. This was the famous double-slit experiment, first performed by Thomas Young in the early 1800s to show that light behaves like a wave. More than a century later, scientists repeated it with tiny particles of matter, and the result was even stranger. Even single particles, fired one at a time, built the same wave pattern, as if each particle somehow passed through both openings at once. Daniel had studied this for years. He understood the math. He knew the words: superposition, probability, wave function. But understanding the words did not make the feeling go away. He reached over and switched on the detectors placed near the slits. Now the machine would record which slit each particle passed through. Nothing else changed. The room was the same. The air was the same. The machine was the same. Only one thing was different. Now the particles were being watched. He pressed the button again. The particles fired. The screen began to glow. But this time, the pattern was different. The soft ripples were gone. Instead, two simple bright lines appeared behind the slits. The particles were no longer behaving like waves. They were acting like solid objects. Choosing one slit or the other, Daniel felt a chill move through him. The experiment should not care whether it was being measured. Metal does not have feelings. Light does not get nervous. Particles do not know when someone is looking. And yet, the result changed the moment information was gathered. He turned the detectors off. The wave pattern returned. He turned them on again. The wave pattern disappeared, again and again. The same result. It was as if reality itself was shifting depending on whether it was observed. Daniel stepped back from the table and stared at the glowing screen. "What does it mean to observe?" he asked softly. Was it the human eye that mattered? Or was it simply the act of measurement, the interaction between systems? The particles did not wait to decide what they were until the last moment. Before measurement, they existed as possibilities. After measurement, only one outcome remained. Possibility collapsed into fact. He looked at his own reflection in the dark window of the lab, faint and uncertain. If something so small, so basic, could exist as pure possibility until it was observed, then what about the larger world? Was reality solid and fixed, or was it still unfolding, waiting for interaction? The thought would not leave him. He had entered the lab believing he was studying particles, but now he felt as if the experiment was quietly studying him. He was not just watching the screen, he was part of the process that changed it. The machine hummed softly in the dark. The patterns glowed and faded, and Daniel understood something unsettling. The experiment did not care about his beliefs, but it did respond to observation. And if observation changes the smallest pieces of reality, then perhaps watching is not passive at all. Perhaps the moment you look at the universe looks back. The next morning, Daniel returned to the lab. With a calmer mind, the fear from the night before had faded, but the question had not. He no longer asked, "How does it know?" Now, he asked something more careful. What does it mean to observe? He opened his notebook and began writing the definitions he had learned in graduate school, in quantum physics. Observation does not mean human eyes. It does not mean thoughts, or feelings, or awareness. Observation means interaction. It means one physical system touching or affecting another. When the detector near the slits is turned on, it interacts with the particle. That interaction changes the particle's state. Before the measurement, the particle is described as a wave of probabilities. It is not in one place. It is not in two places. It is a spread of possible outcomes. This strange state is called superposition. In superposition, multiple paths are possible at the same time, but when measurement happens, the superposition ends. The wave function collapses into one result. One path becomes real, the others disappear. Daniel stared at the equations on the board. The math was clear. The predictions were accurate. Every experiment matched the theory, and yet, the deeper meaning still felt open. He imagined the particle moving toward the two slits, without measurement. It behaves like a wave passing through both openings, with measurement. It behaves like a small object choosing one slit, but what actually causes the collapse? Is it the detector's light? Is it the exchange of energy? Is it the simple fact that information now exists about the particle's path? He rubbed his forehead and walked slowly around the room. The lab felt different in the daylight. Less mysterious, more mechanical. Wires connected to screens. Screens connected to computers. It all looked ordinary. But the behavior it revealed was not ordinary at all. If reality at its smallest level is not fixed until interaction happens, then the universe is not a solid stage where events simply play out. It is more like a field of possibilities, waiting for contact. Daniel paused at that thought, waiting for contact. He looked at his hand resting on the table. When his hand touches the table, both change slightly. Forces push back and forth. Atoms repel each other. Interaction defines their relationship. Maybe measurement is just a deeper version of that. Maybe reality becomes specific only when systems meet. This idea felt less magical and more physical. It was not about human minds controlling particles. It was about connection shaping outcome. Still, a quiet tension remained inside him. If particles do not settle into a single state until interaction, then certainty is not the starting point of reality. Possibility is. He thought about everyday life. People speak as if the world is already decided, already fixed, but at the smallest level, nature itself begins in openness. Only through interaction does one path become real. Daniel closed his notebook slowly. The observer effect was not about eyes or belief. It was about participation. Nothing stands alone. Everything becomes defined through contact. The experiment had not changed its rules overnight. The physics was the same as it had always been. But Daniel felt something shift inside him. He had once imagined himself as separate from what he studied, a neutral watcher standing outside the system. Now he saw that no observation is completely separate. To measure is to interact. To interact is to influence. And influence means you are part of the story. The lab was quiet again. The machine waited. And Daniel understood that the real mystery was not that particles change when observed. The real mystery was that reality itself seems to begin as possibility and only becomes definite when something meets it. Daniel could have stopped there. The observer effect was already strange enough, but curiosity pulled him deeper. If measurement shapes reality at one point, what happens when two particles are connected? He opened a research paper on quantum entanglement, a subject first argued about by Albert Einstein and later tested again and again in modern labs. Einstein did not like the idea. He believed the universe should be local and clear. If something happens here, it should not instantly affect something far away. He once called entanglement spooky action at a distance. Daniel stared at the screen. Spooky. That was not a word scientists use lightly. He read carefully. When two particles interact in a special way, they can become entangled. After that, they are no longer separate systems. They share one combined state. If you measure one particle, the other responds instantly, even if it is on the other side of the world. Not by sending a signal through space, not by traveling faster than light, but because their properties are linked. At a deeper level, Daniel leaned back in his chair. Imagine separating two entangled particles by miles. One goes left, one goes right. They move far apart. To any observer, they look independent. But when one is measured and its state becomes definite, the other's state becomes definite at the same moment. As if distance does not fully divide them, he felt the room grow very quiet around him. The observer effect had already shown that measurement changes outcomes. Now entanglement showed that measurement here can define something there. Reality was not made of small, isolated pieces. It was more like a web. Touch one part, and the tension spreads through the whole structure. Daniel walked to the window and looked out at the city below. Cars moved along the streets. Lights flickered. In distant buildings, everything looked separate. Separate people, separate objects, separate lives. But at the deepest level, the universe did not behave that way at the smallest scale. Separation was not absolute. Connection came first. He imagined two particles born together in the same flash of energy, spinning through space, forever linked, even if galaxies drifted between them. Their shared state would remain. What did that say about the nature of reality? Maybe the universe is not a collection of independent things. Maybe it is a network of relationships. Maybe what we call things are just temporary patterns inside a larger whole. Daniel returned to his desk slowly. If observation defines a particle's state, and entanglement links distant particles into one shared system, then observation does not just affect a single point, it affects a network. The thought made his heart beat a little faster. He had once believed that science was about studying objects from a distance, but now it felt like studying a living web, where every interaction mattered, where nothing was fully alone. The idea was not mystical. It was supported by experiments repeated across decades, careful measurements, precise data. Yet the meaning behind it felt vast. If the universe is woven together at its foundation, then being an observer is not standing outside the system. It is touching the web itself. Daniel looked again at the diagrams of entangled particles on his screen, lines connecting them across empty space. He realized something that both excited and unsettled him. The observer effect was not just about a particle and a detector, it was about relationship. And in a universe built on relationships, no action is ever truly isolated. The deeper Daniel went into physics, the more the question began to turn inward. He had studied particles, waves, and entanglement. He had learned that observation means interaction, but now a quieter question began to rise inside him. What about the one who observes? What about the mind itself? One evening, Daniel sat alone in his apartment, far away from the lab equipment and glowing screens. There were no detectors here, no lasers, no metal plates with slits, only silence. He decided to run a different kind of experiment. He would observe his own thoughts. He closed his eyes and waited. At first, there was only darkness and the sound of his breathing. Then a thought appeared. I should answer that email. A second thought followed. Or maybe I can do it tomorrow. He noticed something strange. Before he made a choice, there was a space. In that space, more than one option existed. He could stand up and open his laptop, or he could stay on the couch. For a brief moment, both futures felt possible. Then, suddenly, one became real. He reached for the laptop. The other option disappeared. Daniel opened his eyes slowly. The pattern felt familiar. Possibility, observation, collapse into action. He knew the brain is not a simple quantum particle. Neurons fire, chemicals move, signals travel through networks. Neuroscience explains behavior through biology. He respected that, but still, the experience of choosing did not feel mechanical. It felt open at first, then definite. He stood up and walked to the kitchen, thinking carefully. When he decides what to eat, is the choice already fixed before he feels it, or does it truly settle in the moment he becomes aware of it? He remembered how particles exist in superposition until interaction forces a result. And he wondered, is awareness a kind of interaction inside the brain when he becomes conscious of a thought? Does that change its path? He was careful not to jump to wild conclusions. He did not believe the mind magically controls atoms, but he could not ignore the pattern he kept seeing at the smallest scale. Reality begins in probabilities. At the human scale, decisions seem to begin in openness. In both cases, something shifts when attention is focused. Daniel sat back down and watched his thoughts again. Some grew stronger when he paid attention to them. Others faded when he ignored them. Fear became louder when he fed it with focus. Calm grew when he rested his awareness on his breath. It was a simple observation, but it felt powerful. Attention shapes experience. Even if it does not rewrite the laws of physics, it changes the world inside the mind. And the world inside the mind shapes actions. And actions shape reality at the human level. Daniel realized that the observer effect might not be about mystical powers. It might be about participation. The mind is not floating outside the universe, watching from a safe distance. It is part of the same web of interaction. Consciousness does not stand apart from reality. It moves within it, influences it, responds to it. For the first time, Daniel felt the experiment move from the lab into his own life. He was not just studying how particles respond to measurement. He was living inside a system where awareness itself plays a role, and the question that once felt abstract now felt personal. If attention shapes inner reality, and inner reality shapes action, then how much of the world around him was formed by what he chose to observe? Daniel began to see his daily life differently. The lab was no longer the only place where reality seemed to shift. Now he noticed it in small, quiet moments. Standing at a crosswalk, he could take the usual route home, or he could turn left and walk through the park. Both paths existed in front of him. For a few seconds, the future felt open. Then he chose. One path became real, the other faded into something that never happened. It was simple, almost too simple, but the pattern was everywhere. Before a decision, there are many possibilities. After a decision, there is one lived outcome. He remembered the particle approaching the two slits. Until measurement, it moved, as a spread of potential paths. After interaction, only one path remained visible. He was not saying that humans are quantum particles, but he could not ignore the similarity in structure. Possibility narrows through interaction. In human life, the interaction is choice. Daniel started to observe how attention works during decision-making. When he focused on fear, his options felt smaller. When he focused on curiosity, new ideas appeared. When he believed something was impossible, he did not even try. That possibility collapsed before it had a chance to grow. He realized something important. Attention is not neutral. What he looked at expanded in importance. What he ignored slowly weakened. If he constantly watched his mistakes, they seemed to define him. If he watched his progress, even small progress, confidence grew. The observer effect in physics was about measurement, shaping outcome. In life, awareness shaped direction. Every conversation carried this quiet power. He could listen carefully, shaping understanding, or he could react quickly, shaping conflict. He could see a challenge as a threat, or observe it as a lesson. The external event might be the same, but the meaning shifted depending on how he met it. Daniel sat at his desk one night, thinking about free will. Are choices fully determined by past causes, or is there a real openness before we act? Science continues to debate this, but his experience told him something clear. In the moment before action, there is awareness, and in that awareness, direction forms. Even if biology sets limits, participation still matters. He understood now that being an observer does not mean being passive. In physics, observation requires interaction. In life, living requires response. No one stands outside the system. Every thought influences the next. Every action changes the environment. Every decision removes certain futures and strengthens others. The idea felt both heavy and empowering. Heavy because it meant responsibility. Empowering because it meant influence. He was not controlling the universe, but he was not powerless either. He was part of a chain of interactions that shaped what came next, and for the first time, Daniel saw that the shift from observer to creator was not dramatic or magical. It happened quietly, in each small choice. In each moment of attention, in each decision about what to focus on. Possibility was always there, but participation determined which possibility became his reality. Daniel returned to the lab one final time that week. The room felt familiar now, not mysterious, not frightening. The machine stood in the center of the table, silent and waiting. The double slits were still there, thin and precise. The screen behind them was blank, ready to glow. Nothing about the equipment had changed, but Daniel had. He switched on the system and watched the particles begin their invisible journey. Without the detectors, the soft wave patterns slowly appeared, bands of light and shadow forming like ripples on water, possibilities spreading across space. He then activated the detectors. The pattern shifted. Two bright lines replaced the waves, clear, simple, definite. The experiment behaved exactly as physics predicted. There was no magic in the wires, no hidden force responding to his thoughts, only interaction shaping outcome. Daniel looked at the glowing screen and felt calm. For days he had searched for something dramatic, some secret that would explain everything, but the truth was quieter than that. Reality at its deepest level begins in openness. Through interaction, that openness becomes specific. Through participation, possibility becomes fact. He realized that the shift from observer to creator is not about controlling particles with the mind. It is about understanding that observation is never separate. In physics, to measure is to interact. In life, to live is to engage. You cannot stand outside the universe and watch it like a movie. You are inside it, influencing and being influenced at the same time. Daniel thought about the choices he had made that week. the paths he had taken, the thoughts he had fed with attention, the fears he had allowed to fade. Each small act had shaped his experience, not by breaking the laws of nature, but by working within them. The universe is not a finished painting hanging on a wall. It is more like a process unfolding in real time. Every interaction adds detail. Every decision sharpens one line and erases another. Daniel turned off the detectors once more and watched the wave pattern return. He smiled slightly. The experiment that once unsettled him now felt like a mirror. It reflected a simple truth. Possibility exists. Interaction defines it. Participation gives it direction. As he powered down the machine and the screen faded to black, one final thought settled in his mind. You are not just a spectator in reality. You are part of the web that shapes it. The moment you understand that, your attention, your choices, and your actions narrow possibilities into lived experience. Is the moment you stop seeing yourself as a passive observer and begin to see that you have always been participating in creation.